Hey, Jordan from the Affirmation Project. I'll do a video on my thoughts on government. Obviously, got my notes here because there's quite a lot of theories and stats that I want to run through. So let's start off with the root of the word government. So you've got two parts to it. You've got govern, which obviously means to control, and you've got mente, which I believe is Latin, and that is for mind. So obviously, if you put the two things together, very conspiratorial, but you do come up with mind control. So I want to start with that because if you think about government and what it actually is, it only really exists within your mind. So you can point to a building and say that's a government building. You can point to a person and say that's a politician or someone who works for the government. But the government itself, I feel like it's some kind of mythical entity that people build up within their heads. The only people who govern are other people. So if you think of government, it's just you and me, everybody. We just feel like we give this construct to this big organization that has these supernatural powers, which it doesn't. It's just regular people like you and me. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole on who's really in control at the top of governments and if they are like you and me. There's plenty of content out there, and that's another video completely. So I've got that generally within this world, humans are fantastic at organization. We can put together projects to build skyscrapers, we can build bridges. We're really good at things like that. But when it comes to managing ourselves, I feel like it all falls apart. So we're not very we have a lot of biases and a lot of corruption when it comes to managing ourselves. So that's very difficult with government because I don't feel like as a human race we've found a formula that works. I mean, they've tried communism multiple times, it's failed every time. There's a lot of statism at the moment, obviously worshipping the state and government. You've got capitalism, which we've given a go as well. But obviously there's different it's kind of a scale. It's not black and white. It's not capitalism and communism. There's a lot of spaces in between, and theories such as corporatism, which we're seeing a lot of, where the big companies really running things behind the background. So back to my point on giving governments supernatural powers. People tend to do this to take away a sense of morality of themselves. So they give their morality over to this institution called government in order to make the hard decisions for them. And if this mythical creature of government makes that decision, then somehow that negates them of any responsibility or morality for the actions that they've taken. For example, if I was to go and pick up a rifle and go start shooting people I deemed as terrorists in the Middle East, I would quickly be arrested, considered a madman, and thrown in a cage, possibly killed, and I would remain in that cage for the rest of my life. But if a government does it, who's made up of people who have no more rights or divine powers than I myself have, if they deem it's necessary to go and do that, then it's perfectly just, it's not illegal, and you can go and kill lots of civilians and terrorists and the bad guys, etc. It's also the same with if I were to walk into your home and ask you for some money, a percentage of what you've earned from your week's labor, then obviously that wouldn't go down very well. That would be illegal, and I'm pretty sure you'd tell me to get lost. But when the government does that, when they steal off you every week from your paycheck, then obviously that's moral and that's just. So we've given this construct of government supernatural powers that yourself or I could never bestow ourselves. So in terms of whether that's moral or morality, government can never be moral, in my opinion. It's always immoral to have any kind of power over another human being. Now, talking about these concepts, you run into other philosophies of how to do things, because obviously people don't know anything different than having government and being told what to do. There is a philosophy called anarchy, which a lot of people have misrepresented, whether that's on purpose or whether that's just by accident. People think of anarchists as burning down buildings, throwing petrol bombs, and obviously anarchists can do that, so can anyone else. But the word anarchy, if we break it down again like we did with government, basically means an, which is not, and archy, which is ruler. So basically no rulers. It means that you rule yourself and no one has any kind of power over you to make you do anything that you wouldn't want to do. Another word for it, which is much more palatable to a lot of people, is voluntarism. So basically, unless you volunteer for something, then you cannot be made to do that. Like if you want to volunteer to give money to your local community in order to start projects and help people, then that's perfectly fine under anarchy and voluntarism. However, when it comes down to government and you're forced to do it, that's very much against the anarchy principle. So you can see the big contradiction there with people putting this label on anarchy, when in fact it's actually the most peaceful way for human beings to coexist, in theory. It's actually government that causes all the violence and the anger, etc., in my opinion. Again, I think I do have a heavy bias against government and more towards anarchy. That's probably related to deeper issues surrounding detachment from society in general, population in general. We're all looking for a different way for things to work. So anarchy is an option for that. It's going to be a long video, I think. Let's have a look. So government, anything within the public sector and government you will find is very inefficient. And in my view, the private sector funds the inefficiencies within government. So just for personal examples myself, I've worked within schools, schooling system, a public school, and I've worked in medium enterprises, purely private sector, and the differences are outstanding. The amount of actual work completed within an 8-hour day in the public sector compared to the private sector, in my experience, is probably less than half. I find that you worked much harder within the private sector because you have to produce to earn your keep. If you're not producing, then the company isn't making enough money to survive, so your role is redundant. Whereas in government roles in the public sector, within my opinion, there's a lot more leniency, whereas you can be inefficient because the taxpayer is always going to foot the bill for the inefficiency, and there's no direct incentive to be more profitable. In fact, the opposite is true because government workers don't want to lose the jobs. They have, they've got the, oh God, I forgot the word now. Trade unions, they've got representatives who want to keep all the jobs. So it's actually within the government's interest to not cause efficiency and kind of lay off workers if jobs become obsolete, etc. And they come under a lot of fire for making redundancies, whereas the private sector would naturally gravitate towards efficiency and laying off people if, kind of technology is advanced and machinery, making jobs redundant there as well. So government, in my eyes, is a big burden on society. I feel like if more stuff was private and more anarchist, so you'd volunteer to do the work and you get paid depending on your worth and your output, then I feel like society in general would be a lot more efficient. But again, that's probably my bias there. So yeah, back to the mythical structure of government. I feel like it's a great source in the world of immorality, and it allows human beings to not be accountable for, killing people, for doing bad things, because they place it on a higher pedestal of, oh, well, the government said to do it. I was only following orders. So I think it's very immoral and unjust way for human beings to coexist. A great speaker on this, if you read his book, is Larkin Rose. He's got a book called The Greatest Superstition. I'll put that in the comments so that you can find it. It's a great eye-opener. He's a lot more extreme than I would be. He runs into a lot about, government workers, police, taxation. He runs into all the different aspects of government, and just reading his book for just a few pages, you kind of realize all the indoctrination starts washing off you that you've had from birth, growing up within these institutions, within the schooling system, etc. Obviously where your parents have grown up and also had that indoctrination. Because you've got to remember that government, the only thing it ever wants to do is grow. It only ever wants to expand its power. So kind of in the same way that a corporation would want to grow, the government does the same thing. And you can see this especially, You just see it around your local neighborhood, the amount of rules and regulations that are coming out. They start regulating more industries more heavily until before long, a kid can't even open up a lemonade stand, is the classic example, without having, 15 permits and etc. etc. And usually this happens throughout history. The government will expand its control until a breaking point where people just have had enough. And that's when revolutions tend to happen. So the government has to toe a fine line between invading every part of our lives and doing it on such a level, whereas we don't really notice. It's like bringing a frog to boil. If you put a frog in a frying pan and turn up the heat, as long as it starts cold, it actually won't realize that it's being boiled until it's too late and it'll die. The same theory applies, in my opinion, to people within society. The government has to toe that line between not turning up the heat too much so that we realize how badly we're being screwed. And an example of people realizing this is in France at the moment with the yellow vest movement, which is spreading to a lot of Europe as well. They always say the revolution won't be televised, so you will have to go to other sources of media to really see coverage and what's really happening within that. I mean, I've been watching the news lately. I usually don't, but I've had a television around me, so I've been turning it on more and more just to observe. And there is absolutely no mention of the yellow vest movement, but I know for a fact it's still going on due to my independent media that I watch on channels via YouTube, such as We Are Change, etc. So that's just an example of how the government wants to control you and doesn't want you to realize that these movements are happening and why they're happening, because more people might clock on, the domino effect happens, and then they lose their control. Let's have a look. So I've posed a question here of I wanted to know the amount of people killed by governments within the last 100 years, because you could talk about all these different theories, but the facts that hit home the hardest is going to be how many people have died as a result of government. So after doing some research, I found that during the 20th century, so until the year 2000, 260 million people worldwide were killed by governments. That's unarmed civilians, so 260 million people. That's 6 times more than the amount of people who were actually killed in conflict and war in the 20th century. But in my opinion, war and conflict is a result of government anyway, so you could actually add those people onto the 260 million. It's not like a comparison, the two are the same, in my opinion. If we just look at the USA, the poster boy for the last 17 years, so since 2001, it's about 18 years even on the war on terror. So the US has killed 500,000 people directly as a result on the war on terror. So such as Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., Syria, all those places that they invade. So half of those people of the 260 of the 500,000 people, sorry, were civilians. So not even armed extremists. So they were civilians. And that's several times higher. Actually, the figure of 500,000 is several times higher when you factor in the disease, the displacement, the utilities that they've knocked out. So the 500,000 is direct combat. Now, compared to worldwide, 263,000 people were killed worldwide within the same period. So the US has killed 500,000 people directly, more than the whole world within that period. And they were killed in that period due to terrorism worldwide. Now, in the US, only 3,310 people have been killed due to terrorism in the last 18 years. Sorry, I know I'm throwing a lot of stats at you here. But if we just focus on this one, so 9/11 was just over 3,000 people died there. And then in the next sort of 17 years on from 9/11, around 310 people were killed due to terrorism. So does that justify the US government killing 500,000 people overseas as a result of that? I mean, it doesn't take, I could ask that question to a 5-year-old and they'd tell me that there's something else going on there. So if we just look at that example from governments around the world, and the US obviously being the biggest and most powerful, you can see the effect that government has. And the big standout thing to me is that not many people, some people obviously do, have an issue with this. Nobody realizes that we're just needlessly killing people overseas, and that due to government that's made possible. due to the government stealing from you every week and taking your taxes, it's possible for them to go overseas and kill all these people, civilians included, through the ploy of terrorism. I mean, we can even go back to the point and argue all day whether terrorism was actually organic and whether 9/11 was actually a real event. If not, then it's even worse. So they've gone overseas to do this for other reasons, not just for terrorism, to protect Americans at home. Do Americans need protecting? I don't know when the last attack on America was. I think it was Pearl Harbor. And if you're in these circles, you know that that's pretty, you can argue whether that was real as well. Right. So there's a lot of information there I just threw at you. Let's see what else I've got here. I've actually put a comment here that religion is more powerful than, government is more powerful than religion, which is kind of a bold statement, but I'll explain why. So in religion, you have things such as thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, which are good principles to live by. But when it comes to government, those same people, such as Christians with those principles, will turn around and completely abandon them in order to, kind of confer with this mythical creature government. In order, if they want to go overseas and get the terrorists and kill them, they'll happily put the thou shalt not kill aside of an avid Christian. And then if the government wants to tax you, thou shalt not steal, people who are religious will happily pay them taxes and receive benefits from the government, which is an indirect form of stealing from your neighbor. If you take a benefit from the government, where do you think that benefits come from? All your neighbors have paid for it. So thou shalt not steal becomes completely, you're stealing. You know what I mean? You're killing indirectly and you're stealing. You're just hiding behind this entity called government in order to do it. So in my opinion, government or mind control is a lot more powerful than religion. And maybe that's why we've seen this shift from religion having all the power back in the day to government. They found a more efficient way to control us, and things that wouldn't stand in religion are now, fair game within the government system of doing things. So yeah, they're my views on government. Feel free to prove me wrong. I know there are a lot of socialists and statists out there that would argue government's a necessary evil, and you run into the theory of totalitarianism when you go down that route of do the greater good. And in my opinion, morality and whether things are moral comes on an individual level. Just because something's for the greater good does not mean that it's moral. And yeah, basically the takeaway message for me is that government is an excuse to not be moral. Cheers.